This morning, I want to give the last talk on Inmo. And Inmo means suchness, or things just as they are. It's a fasicle from Dogen ShoboGenzo, Treasury of the True Dharma I. And in this last section, Dogen relays a dialogue between Yaoshan and his master Nanyue. So Yaoshan starts by telling Nanyue that he thinks he has a really firm grasp on intellectual teachings about Buddhism. But then he says, I once heard that in the South, they say, pointing directly at the human mind, seeing the nature and attaining Buddhahood, this I haven't really understood yet. I humbly hope your reverence will compassionately instruct me about this. So this question about pointing directly to the human mind and seeing the nature is not different than how we learn about ourselves and learn about the Buddha nature through practice itself. So attaining Buddhahood means that our hearts, our minds, that we have the ability to respond to impermanence, to respond to the causal conditions of our life, and also that those responses are based on our interbeing with all beings and our interconnection with all beings. So out of that, if we truly understand that, is going to come compassion, wisdom, and out of that will be skillful means, which is that we're going to have a skillful response to the situations that greet us and the people that greet us. And that response, in turn, is going to alleviate suffering for ourselves and for others. So a basic question I think we should be asking ourselves about practice is, how do we directly enact our Buddha mind through our actions and responses to each person and each situation that we encounter? So that's kind of the basics of what it is that I would say that we're up to in practice. This is realization. So our awakening, our awakened mind, is based on this direct engagement with reality, which we do through the self. Dogen says in Genjo Koan, study the self, know the self. What are we studying when we study the self? We're not studying Western psychology when we're studying the self. We're studying the self as it relates to impermanence. We're studying the self as it relates to causal conditions. We're studying the self as this independent self, which is not an independent self at the same time. Simultaneously, it is the self that is the self of all being. We're studying that. How is it that that self integrates with this self that we perceive as being independent? And out of that integration of self and other comes wisdom, skillful means, and compassion. That's what Dogen is calling dropping body and mind in Genjo Koan. So we do this by directly engaging reality through, again, studying this self. And then, as Dogen says in Genjo Koan, forgetting the self, dropping body and mind. So Nanyue responds to Yaoshan. He said, such cannot be God. In other words, things just as they are cannot be held on to. Not such cannot be God. So the not of this cannot be held on to. Both such and not self can't be God. So in other words, however you parse this, you can't concretize it. You can't turn it into something. And then he says, so what are you going to do about that? How are you going to respond to that? By the way, just for those of you geeky Buddhists out there, this is a tetralemma. This is something that, is not, both is and is not, and is not. So anyway, it's a logic device that Nagarjuna uses, which means that you basically can't land anywhere. So you can't get at it, you can't grasp it, you can't hold on to it, you can't concretize the answer by using your intellect. You have to practice in a way that you directly communicate with your deepest mind and heart, not by intellectually talking about practice. So Nanue asked the question, how are you going to do that? And I think that's a really good question for all of us. That should be our question. How are we going to do that? So then Dogen comments about this teaching. He says, in his inimitable way, he says, Nanue is not saying it is limited. He is not saying it is unlimited. We should study such in case such in can't be got. We should question can't be got in such. So it would be something like, we should study things as they are. We can't hold on to things as they are. And then he says, these things that we cannot get, things as they are that cannot be got or held on to, do not have to do only with the measure of the Buddha of the Buddha. Understanding can't be got, awakening can't be got. So you can't hold on to any of this stuff. You can't concretize it. You can't say, oh, it's always going to be this way. I'm always going to respond this way in this situation. You can't make up a rule about it. So true understanding and your Buddha mind's response to this true understanding can't be got at with your intellect. It's not something that can be caught, put in a jar, understood, and held by a person. Enlightenment is not a person, does not have possession of enlightenment. Enlightenment is an interactive event. Awakening is an interactive event. If you try to hold on to it, if you've grown up on the East Coast where there are fireflies, you know that the next morning, all the fireflies you caught are dead in the jar. You cannot hold on to these fireflies. Again, even knowing this, how do we cultivate this mind? How do we awaken? So Dogen ends the fasicle by saying this. He says, these words mean that because such is not to be doubted, is not to be understood, because it is what thing. Truly, we should always investigate the myriad things as being what thing. In other words, we should always investigate the myriad things as just this thing at this moment, which also includes all of the myriad things. Truly, we should always investigate a single thing as what thing. That what thing is not to be doubted is come such. That thing that is not to be doubted is reality itself, manifesting itself at this moment, right now, in front of your face. Can you see it? Can we respond to it? Can we respond to impermanence, interconnection? Can we respond to the fact that we are completely interbeing with that our isness of all things functioning together at the same time as we independently are not separate beings, but that we have particularity in the midst of these myriad things, which are not different from the self. So Dogen's final words give us a direction. He tells us something about how we should practice. First, he says, don't doubt the reality of the Buddha Dharma. In Buddhism, faith is not blind faith. In Buddhism, you're given a teaching, and then you practice that teaching, and at some point the teaching should make sense to you. It's like if we say, there is suffering, there is an end to suffering, which has to do with letting go, not being attached. It has to do with not trying to continue some sense of self that is not helpful. So if you're addicted to drugs, you are taking drugs with the idea that you will alleviate your suffering. But at some point, you will find out, if you do the practice of working with addiction, that what you think is alleviating your suffering is actually the cause of your suffering. Buddhism is like that kind of faith, right? It's not a faith that is never, that's just a kind of blind faith that never makes any sense to you in some way. So Dogen says, don't doubt the reality of the Buddha Dharma. Don't doubt that all things seen as independent are still not separate in their interbeingness with all things, and that all things reside in each other. This is this interconnection. Stated another way, to know one thing is to know all things, which is a Huayan phrase. This is what he says, study the self. To study the self is to know the self. To know the self is to forget the self. Why do you study the self? Because this one thing of studying the self liberates you from the attachments that cause suffering. Because you see that you are impermanent. You see that you are interconnected. You see that you have these relationships. Out of this arises wisdom and compassion and skillful means. Of course, our attachment to self and having it our way gets in the way of that, because we think that if we get what we want, that we'll be happy. If we get what we want over what is perhaps someone else's needs, that we feel like we don't have to take into account because we want to get what we want. So we are in this, Buddhism says we always have to remember that we're in this mandala of life. We're in this mandala of everything that's happening simultaneously. Okay, so the main question here in this talk is, how do we find our way to this mind, to this Buddha mind in Soto Zen? So now I want to give you a concrete example of how I think this works in our practice. So our practice begins with vow or intention. And in this particular example, the intention is, I'm going to go to the Zendo in the morning. That's our intention. Now, if you're living in a monastery, they ring the wake-up bell every morning by your cabin if you're at Tassajara. And in some ways, you don't have any choice about it. You've made this commitment, you're going to go and you're going to follow the schedule. And if you don't follow the schedule, somebody's going to ask you why you're not following the schedule. And ultimately, in a strict monastic environment, somebody's going to ask you to leave if you don't follow through with this schedule, which is powerfully helpful in teaching us something about dropping the self. But we make this intention that we're going to go to Zazen. So when we make this intention at home, our alarm goes off, and depending on whatever our preferences are, we do whatever we're going to do in the morning before we get in our car, or we walk to the Zendo, and we go to the Zendo, and we arrive there, and now we are doing this formal practice. As soon as you walk in the door, this practice, this formal practice begins. So yesterday morning, on Friday, we did our weekly well-being and memorial service. So within this context of the structure of doing service and the structure of doing Zazen together, I'll just give you some examples that we kind of talked about yesterday. But we pay attention to, we take care of the beings, because in Soto Zen, in Mahayana Buddhism, well, not all Mahayana Buddhist schools, but anyway, in the schools, Chinese schools that Soto Zen comes from, everything is sentient. All beings have a kind of sentiency. So what's important about that? What's important about that, at least to my mind, is that it means that everything needs to be treated with a kind of respect. So it means that, we fluff our zafus when we get up, when we're sitting. We fold up the cover to the makugyo and carefully put it on the divider there when we get ready to hit the makugyo. We go around and we straighten the zavatons. And Sue Walter always says, make sure the zippers are in the inside. So she's saying we're creating this sacred space for ourselves to practice in, but we're also respecting and taking care of these things that are in our environment that help us to practice. The zafus help us to practice. The zavatons help our practice. This is part of what Dogen and Gyoji calls continuous practice. Everything, the chairs, everything here, this temple. During COVID, Jaku and I came to the Zendo every day because we wanted to keep it awake. We could have stayed at home and done this on Zoom, but by coming to the Zendo and lighting incense every day on the altar, we kept the Zendo alive. It's like this Zendo has a life that we feed as it feeds us. When we do this, when we come to practice in this way, we are inculcated with this. We don't know it, we don't think about it, but this is part of our practice life. This is this mandala. This is Buddha nature. Dogen says in Tenso Kyokon, a blade of grass is a Buddha. A lettuce leaf, actually it says lettuce leaf, a lettuce leaf is a Buddha. Treat this piece of lettuce as a Buddha. So again, we fluff our zafus because these zafus are our good friends and they support us while we sit zazen. Same thing for the chair. When we're at home, we wash dishes. Oh, we can say, well, I'm washing my dishes just practically because if I wash dishes, then they're not dirty and I can use them again. But also we wash dishes, if we do this with the mind of Buddha, we wash dishes because this is how we thank and take care of dishes for the way that they take care of us. And so we stack them carefully in the cabinet. We wash them carefully when we wash them. We don't have to be obsessive about it, but it's like we take care of the things that are taking care of us. So in this way, we honor and care for the practice of the dishes. And Gyoji Dogen says, everything is practicing. The whole world is practicing, making the sun and the moon and the stars. The dishes are practicing. We can't talk to the dishes and say, hey, what are you practicing? But their practice that we see is this practice of helping us. And so how do we help them do that practice? So we should cultivate this. And by doing this in the Zendo, it starts to, if you will, it starts to just magically or without our knowledge. It's not something that we can get, right? It's something that comes into our hearts and minds and encourages us to practice. So as we do these things in the Zendo, they become part of the rest of our lives. So when we chant sutras, we chant various texts, Buddhist texts. One thing that happens when we chant a text over and over again is that it pops into our head at various times, that it becomes a kind of support for us that we're not even aware of. Also, when we chant in the Zendo, we have to chant with other people. So we harmonize ourselves with each other. We take a moment, we listen to each other. We chant with our ears so that we can hear we can hear ourselves, but we can also hear others simultaneously. The person who's hitting the makugyo, the wooden drum that keeps time when we chant sutras in Japanese, that person has to listen to how fast we're going. So if we are not keeping up with them, they want to slow down and we catch up with each other, or as the people who are chanting, we're listening to the Makugyo and we want to stay on that rhythm with the Makugyo the best that we can. This is all interactive. This is all interbeing. This activity is the source of wisdom and compassion and skillful means. This is how we learn this. When you're in a Sangha, sometimes, especially like at San Francisco Zen Center, a big training temple where I was, sometimes I was the boss. Sometimes I was not, I was the follower. When I was the CFO in charge of the accounting department at San Francisco Zen Center, I had a student who worked for me, but he was also on the board. So when he was on the board, when he was being a board member, I was being subordinate to him as a board member. When he was working for me in the office, he was being subordinate to me. So it's like these higher, there's the, Dogen says, the nose is straight, the eyes are horizontal. When we're straight, when we're hierarchical, be hierarchical. When we're horizontal, be horizontal. It's like, and then conflict arises. Something happens. We're unhappy, we're suffering with each other. How do we resolve those problems? We resolve them through practice. What is its practice? All the times that we chanted together, all the times that we were together in the Zendo, all the time that we sat silently together in the Zendo, all of those times help us to become in harmony with each other. It's like we're all playing by the same rules, if you will. It's like we all understand this Buddhist practice as having certain parameters. We say the precepts, right? We say we have lots of things like the precepts, but what use are the precepts if we're not applying them to any given situation? They become a guide for us. How is it that I interact with other Sangha members in this generous way? How is it, as Suzuki Roshi said, letting students have a big field? By the way, having a big field didn't mean there weren't any fences around that field, but he was saying, okay, we all need to knock around a little bit. We all need to be generous with each other with the things that we do that aren't skillful. So we give each other a big field of generosity. And at the same time, that field has a fence around it. And the fence around it is, maybe it's the precepts, maybe it's do not take what is not given. It is the teacher saying, okay, I'm sorry, big field, and please straighten the zafus. Please fluff the zafus. Please take care of these things that take care of you. Please take care of the altar. This is how we do it. And so you might say, well, I don't want to do it that way. It's like, why? Shinshu says, oh, go in and take this little piece of paper and I want you to just, go around the edge of the lavender buds that we use instead of chip incense. I want you to go around that little edge and make a little edge and have it smoothed out with this little edge on the side. And you say, well, what's the point of that? Why would I do that? Because it takes care of what you're doing, and also because you have to pay attention, because we have to put ourselves into the activity of cheating, put ourselves into the activity of doing these things that relate to the incense and the altar and the candles, doing these things that relate to keeping the Zendo clean. So these actions inform the rest of our lives. When we leave the Zendo, you may think to yourself, oh, gotta go do this, I gotta go do that. But it's like Dogen talks about in Zuriwanki, he says, it's like you're walking through a field. In this case, he has robes on. You're walking through a field that has dew on the grass. And by the time you get to the other side of the field, your robes are wet all the way up to the knees. I bet everybody's had this experience walking through wet grass. You don't even notice it, but by the time you get to the other side of the field, your pants are completely wet up to the knees. So this is what these activities are. In Zazen, we keep coming back to the present moment. We make this vow to keep coming back. We were talking about this yesterday. In Zazen, you know, if you're sitting in a room with people and somebody coughs, inevitably 3 other people are going to cough, because there's something about that. We have this interconnected relationship that's going on with each other. And so we may see ourselves as in this little pod sitting on our zabuton, you know, and maybe our eyes are closed or open or whatever, but we think we're on this little 4x4 square zabuton, and we feel kind of very separate. But we're in a room with other people, and in that room, if we move, other people start moving too. Now, I'm not suggesting that you should harm yourself by not moving, but we are in an interconnected relationship with each other. We're not separate pods. We are interconnected with each other in the Zendo, and that interconnection goes into the rest of your life as well, even though you don't feel it, you don't know it, you don't think about it. So it's subtle. But you know, it comes from making this vow. It comes from saying, yes, I'm going to do this. Yes, I'm going to do this thing. I'm going to make this effort to do this. So in this formal practice, which in Soto Zen involves, like, for example, we don't do we do soji here on Friday morning. So it's like you come to Zazen, you sit, then we start chanting with each other, and then we do work with each other, and then we go out into the world and do the rest of our life. So there's this way in which we start out our morning very quiet together, silently. Then we do service in which we are more active. We are using our voices, we are chanting, but it's very much about being in harmony with each other. And then we do work practice, which is more active, which is engaging in a different kind of way with the Zendo. And then we go out in the world. And so this morning ritual is going to affect the rest of our day. So I'm going to end by reminding you of one of the very first things that Dogen said in Inmo. He said, if you want to get such a thing, you should be such a person. And let's see, he's quoting another Zen teacher, Chinese Zen teacher named Yunju Daoying. So he's quoting Daoying, and Daoying said, if you want to get such a thing, so if you want to get this practice, if you want to liberate your Buddha nature, let's say, if you want to understand things just as they are, if you want to get such a thing, you should be such a person. Since you are such a person, why worry about such a thing? We are all Buddha nature, all beings, everything interconnected, interbeing, causally related, impermanent, etc., etc., etc. This is the basis of wisdom, compassion, and skillful means. If you want to get such a thing, you can't get such a thing because you are already such a thing. So there's no such a thing to get. But he says you should be such a person, which is to say that from our perspective, you should practice. You should do this practice. If you're not going to do this practice, I would say from a more sectarian point of view, do some practice. do some practice that awakens your wholesome mind. So he said, you have to be this person, you have to do this practice. Since you are already this person, so as soon as you do this practice, because you are already this person, then he says, why worry about such a thing? So you don't need to worry about this. You need to do it. You know, it's like when I used to write, being all of us, you know, go to college, we're in high school or whatever, and we're have to write a paper or something. And we spend all this time angsting about the paper, you know, like, oh, I'm going to write this paper. What am I going to do? I have to write this paper. I have to write this paper. We don't write the paper. We just worry about writing the paper. And probably if we spent all that time that we spent worrying about writing the paper, we would have had the paper done before the time it was due. It's kind of like that. It's like, we can come to lectures, we can talk about it, we can think about it, we can intellectualize about practice, but you have to do the practice. If you want to be such a person, which you already are, then please do the practice that liberates such a person that you already are. So just follow this vow, make this vow, do the practice, make your best effort. And then, as Dogen says in Fukan Zazengi, which we chant every Thursday, your treasure store will open of itself. Thank you very much.